Allen's Investigate, airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans. Yay, and welcome to the Allen's Investigate with me, Shona Allen.
And I'm Gary Allen, the Cockney Bard.
We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and also on Roku. Now, this week, we'd like to welcome very special guest, Andrew Gough, well-known and fascinating TV presenter, writer, researcher, and editor of the Heretic magazine. It's been estimated that Andrew's television work is viewed by over 2 million people globally each week, and you may well have seen him on Ancient Aliens, Forbidden History, Ancient Top 10, and NASA's Unexplained Files, to name a few. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
Thank you. Hey, guys, how you doing?
Good, thank you.
Not bad,
yourself?
Thank you. How about you?
Yeah, really well. Good to see you again.
You're looking well.
Fabulous Friday to you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
My second favorite F word.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, we're on Instagram and inside jokes about some of the posts that we make. We're very Instagram, it must be said. So if you're not on our accounts, you should seek us out.
Yeah, definitely. There's always some witty banter going on, isn't there, on Instagram?
Although if anybody adds me on Instagram, it's Mr. Andrew Gough New. It will tell you, are you sure you want to add Mr. Andrew Gough? Because he has continuously and repeatedly violated community standards.
You naughty boy.
Badge of honor. Yeah. Welcome to 1984, right?
Yeah,
it's terrible, isn't it?
Bless you.
Yeah.
Well, I thought tonight, we're going to be chatting about your fascinating research on the sacred bee, and what you call the Hidden Hive of History and the forgotten god of the ancients. So how exactly did you get drawn into this particular subject, Andrew?
Well, so many things that are passions of ours collectively, we don't fall into them in an organized, I'm going to research the esoteric history of bees, and I'm going to start with goddesses. No, it's completely out of left field that these things oftentimes come to you. And gosh, it must have been almost 20 years ago when I was deep into the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery, and we did a whole show on that, right?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And that led me, as chairman of the society that studied it. And all of a sudden, this woman, Patrice Chaplin, comes along, and she's written this book called City of Secrets. It talks about Girona, Spain, Catalan being the real epicenter of the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau. It's where the priest Baron Giussani was really going when he disappeared for days on end. And the book was fascinating. So I went there with her on several occasions. And the key character in the book is a Kabbalist. And this woman appears to be just really a cut above the rest of us in terms of her esoteric knowledge. And Patrice is very famous, right? Her books have been made into Hollywood films. She did not want me to meet this woman, but Patrice had to get in touch with her. I had the car, so we ended up going to meet her. And she and I clicked like that. And within literally 15 seconds of meeting her, we're talking about Jed pillars and ancient Sumeria. It was just nuts.
Yeah.
And she's passed now, but she was maybe 15, 20 years older than I. And she quickly invited me to study with her. She taught Salvador Dali and John Cocteau. So I was like, yeah.
Wow.
So I fly down again on a later date, and we're sitting on our balcony in the Costa Brava, getting ready to study the Rennes-le-Chateau parchments. And a bee flies around our breakfast table, and we get to talking about bees, totally abandoned the Rennes-le-Chateau stuff. And for the next 3 years, we had study weekends where I would listen 15 hours a day to a fire hose of information that you could never say, excuse me, I need a comfort break, or I'm kind of hungry, or no, you just listen. And did that for 3 years. And then I started to write about it. Back in the time when bees weren't trendy, they hadn't started to get ill, and people weren't really talking much about them.
Yeah, it's funny because we love bees, don't we?
We do
Yeah,
indeed. We're often rescuing them in the garden.
especially the bumblebee. The bumblebees out.
Yes, you guys do it. You absolutely love bees. Your Instagram is full of them.
Yes. I've always been attracted to the bees, so that's quite interesting. Yeah, and nature.
Well, it's interesting with the sorry, Andrew. It's interesting with the Jean Cocteau link, because you've been to church at Leicester Square, where the Jean Cocteau mural is?
Oh yes.
Oh my word, yeah. And you see the cross legs and the rose underneath the cross legs, which like rose cross. Yeah, very interesting.
I would love to get your take on that, and I wouldn't mind a little detour into that, because I've written, in case any production houses are listening, a treatment for a documentary about that.
All right, interesting.
Because it's one of London's hidden gems, isn't it? This Cocteau comes to town, his film is playing, and he spends a week at Notre Dame de France and creates this mural of the crucifixion, but you don't see who's crucified. All you see is the waist down. And there's a picture of what's clearly Jesus looking at the person who's crucified, crying and not happy. And there's a picture of Cocteau looking like, I know what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of others. There's a black sun. There's eagles. There's dice with numerology inferred in the numbers. And to me, I think it's a great platform because I think Cocteau is asking the question, well, who did die? If Jesus is looking at somebody on the cross, was it Simon who carried the cross? And they were, and the Quran says that Jesus wasn't crucified. It's the guy who carried the cross for him. The Romans thought it was Jesus, or was it Jesus? And Joseph of Arimathea put some sort of substance up to his face and make him look like he had died, so they would take him down. Or I look at those legs. And I look at the feet in particular.
Yep.
They're feminine.
Yeah, there's some, I was going to say that there's some very, very deep esoteric symbolism in that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So one of the really bizarre things that I ask, it's speculative, right? But if Jesus is standing looking at the figure on the cross and crying, and there's a black sun, which infers, some hidden esoteric knowledge. What if it's Mary Magdalene? What if the leader of the church is actually the true leader of the church is on the cross? I know that's like sacrilegious, and no one's ever said that, but it's one of the things I think about when I look at the feminine aspect of the legs being painted.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's food for thought, but I think he was very much into he was deeply esoteric. So I think there's an awful lot of symbolism, some hidden wisdom in there, I think, personally.
Well, I couldn't take my eyes off the feet with the cross underneath it. Straight away I thought Rose Cross, So it just sort of stuck out to me, that one piece.
Yeah, and if you look on the murals in his tomb, they're very similar imagery. So yeah, Cocteau was an initiate, and according to some, a Grandmaster of the Priory of Zion. And so I was just dead interested to study with somebody who had taught him and Salvador Dali. It was that region. It's Dali land. Basically where this Kabbalist lived, and to this day, I've written, tens of thousands of words from my time with Ingrid, the Kabbalist, but that represents about 10% of what she showed me, because the rest of it just kind of went. I don't know if I still grasp it. So I've written about what I understood, and now it's it's common knowledge. A lot of this stuff. 4 or 5 years ago, the first Egyptologist wrote about it. And when I say it, Egypt, the delta, the land around the pyramids, is called Tabidi, land of the bee. What's the pharaoh's title? Beekeeper. Okay, there's a picture of a bee in his royal cartouche. You have all the goddesses and gods. The Neith, one of the earliest goddesses in Egypt. Where is she buried? In the house of the bee. How about Osiris, Lord of the Dead, buried in the mansion of the bee? And they're both in Sais, which is in the Delta. And people talk about the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta is right next to Sais, and the Rosetta Stone used to be in Sais, but it got moved to Rosetta, the next village. And Sais is the only place where we get the legend of Atlantis. So you have the legend of Atlantis coming from the only place it was ever mentioned is in Egypt, when Solon, the Greek lawgiver, goes there, and they say, on these pillars we have the legend of how Atlantis was, came into disrepair and how it fell. But this place is like the center of bee veneration, with Neith and Osiris buried in mansions and houses of the bee. So the fact that the bee is so prevalent, the sedge in the bee's on every temple, but nobody ever talks about it. And so I got really into that, and went from Egypt and went even earlier to the first king, arguably, Min, pre-dynastic times. He came from allegedly Sumeria, and they dragged these boats through the eastern Egyptian desert into the Nile Valley. And I've been with David Roll and Toby Wilkinson on those trips in the eastern desert. And all the paintings and all the stones are boats with people dragging them with rope. But in the boats, there is a clear image of a hive in the center of the boat, and then somebody standing with their arms up in the air over their head, like a dancing goddess. And that's an image that is protection from the evil eye of the honey harvest. I mean, to this day in Greece, they'll do the honey harvest at night because it's safer from the evil eye. So, bees were brought into Egypt, and, I always thought it was crazy that people, everyone can imagine Tutankhamun's death mask, right? So yellow and black horizontal stripes.
Bit of a clue.
Okay, what's his title? Bee King.
Yeah.
What's the picture in his royal cartouche? It's a bee, and so his headdress reflects that. And so many, the Jed pillar, which is this iconic Egyptian symbol, and people are like, oh, it represents the backbone of a bull. Okay, it kind of looks like that. But when you get a chance to look at a Jed pillar, compare it to a honey dripper. They're identical. And there's just so much that, the Egyptian kind of, it looks like a sword when you look at it. The pharaoh will be holding it. But you notice it has like this sort of shape, this cup shape on the bottom and a cup shape on top, which is what a beekeeper uses to get the hive out of the tree without getting stung. It goes on and on that, Egypt was really like, one of the golden ages of bee veneration. And it had been completely, literally completely ignored. I think just until recent times, and now Egyptologists are finally, starting to talk about, it looks like bees were important in Egypt.
Finally, yeah. I think the thing is important also to note that with not only Egyptian symbolism but ancient symbolism, it didn't necessarily always just have one meaning. Sometimes there were multi-layered meanings to things as well.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that I really ponder is, the Egyptians, early Egyptians were kind of contemporaries with the Minoans, and the whole Minoan language has been lost except for one word. And it's the word for bee, which is Sphex. The Greeks knew that Minoan word for bee was Sphex. And the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau had many different names, Arabic and all kinds of different names, but it's the Greeks that named it Sphinx. And the Greeks knew the Minoan word for bee was Sphex. So it's interesting because you have so many goddesses in this kind of Minoan early Egyptian era portrayed as sphinxes with dresses with the horizontal stripes. That's always a giveaway to a bee goddess, is the horizontal stripes like on a bee's abdomen, and they are they're everywhere. So when the Greeks looked at the Sphinx in the Giza Plateau, were they thinking they were looking at a bee goddess?
Quite possibly, because obviously the goddess is associated not only with bees but also lions. So I can see why they would think that.
Yeah, no, and the lions are really an interesting piece of the bee veneration, because there's goddesses. I mean, you can see goddesses, from Çatalhöyük, big mother goddesses, and they're laden in honey. They're orange, they're yellow, because they're bee goddesses. And it's only later that we have Cabela and Artemis and various other goddesses that are associated with bees. But it's Cabela that really has always fascinated me. The goddess of forest and trees, and where bees live. And she comes from Kubaba in the Hittite era. And she is the original bee goddess. So I became kind of obsessed about the oldest monument of Cabela. So Cabela, in a lot of images, has the two lions in front of her, and she's on the chariot. It's like the tarot card, only it's a woman. And that is in a place an hour north of Isiphus in Turkey. And I remember the first time I rocked up there hoping to find its giant 50-foot Hittite carving of Cabela up on the mountain. And there's this old postcard of this really old chap just having a nap there. He's lying literally on her feet. One of these old romantic postcards. And I'm like, God, I've got to go there. I want that shot, So I found it. I'm like, great. It's got to be 80, 90 meters away from the parking lot. Piece of cake.
Right.
And I go maybe 30 meters, 40 meters, totally lost. I keep going. The brambles are so bad. There's actually blood streaming down my legs. Ooh. And I get so disorientated that I don't know where I am. And my expensive new sunglasses are ripped off my head, literally. And I spent 20 minutes trying to find them. Nowhere. They're gone. I'm bleeding. And 3 hours later, I give up and I go back to the parking lot, just a bloody mess.
Ooh.
And I would try it 2 years later. But this time I'm like, I'm getting a guide. I know it's only 90 meters. I can see it from the parking lot. And I get a guide. He's really cocky. He's a young guy. And we go up a path. And after about 40 minutes, imagine 40 minutes, it's only 80 meters. He's lost.
Oh, no.
Now 3 hours, and we can't find our way. We don't know which way to go. And he's calling his phone. He's panicking. And he runs away and he leaves me there. And now it's nighttime. And now I feel how panic sets in when you're like on a mountain and there's no way you can't. It's just a sheer cliff going down. I felt so like either I'm going to stay up here and get someone to lift me off and take me away in the morning, or I'm going to run and jump off this wall and hope the trees break my fall. So that's what I did. I returned to the parking lot, a bloody mess. And I still have never gotten to see Cabela. It's like she doesn't want me to.
How bizarre.
Maybe it just wasn't the right time.
People tell me you need to go back with a woman, and maybe that would help. It's and there's pictures. I have a blog about it, so you can see it on my website, and it's so close, and it's this iconic image. But my obsession with Cabela and the bees, sort of prompted me to go and, the most, besides that big Hittite statue, the most famous incarnation of the original bee goddess Cabela is a meteorite. And it's in the, maybe an hour's drive outside of Ankara in Turkey. And I went there, incredible. And so I saw the spot where the most famous meteorite in history sat. This is the bee goddess. And Rome, during the war against Hannibal, meteorites were falling from the sky. They thought that was a bad omen. They were losing the war. And so they consulted the Sibylline text, which are written in hexameter format by bee goddesses earlier. And they said, oh, this is bad. You can't give a day of honor to a god, or this is really bad. You have to go and get the bee goddess. You have to get Cabeli and bring her back to Rome. So they go to Delphi to consult, wait for it, the Delphic bee, oracle priestess, to make sure that this is the right thing to do, to go get Cabeli and bring it back to Rome. So they do that, bring it back to Rome, and it's chaos for years because Cabeli had a castration cult of men, of priests, and on the 24th of March every year, the Day of the Blood, they had to pass a law to tell the men in Rome to stop castrating themselves in honor of Cabela, the bee goddess. And anyway, they put her up into her own temple eventually. And that meteorite, that black stone, disappears from history respectfully. Right at the same time, the black stone of Mecca appears. The most venerated stone in the history of humankind is the stone in Mecca. And what was its original name? Respectfully, it wasn't Allah, it was Alat, which means the old woman, the woman of fate, the stone of fate. And what better for a meteorite that fell from the sky? And priestesses would circle it naked counterclockwise 7 times in honor of it. And it was always known as the old woman. So I argue that the greatest manifestation of the goddess, and she was a bee goddess, is the most venerated stone in history, which is the black stone of Mecca.
It's interesting as well because obviously pre-Islam, allegedly there were supposed to have been 360 idols in a circle, and the black stone was in the center.
Wow.
And also what's quite interesting is that and they still do this today, they actually circle anti-clockwise Isn't that what the sun does?
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating when you think about it. And what did so you have Eschenbach, who wrote Parsifal, never wrote fiction, only wrote history, and now he's talking about Parsifal. And what's the Grail? A stone from heaven. What's a stone from heaven? A meteorite. So is that the Grail? You know, is the stone of Mecca, which could be Kybele? Is it also the Grail? Is the bee goddess the Grail stone? I mean, it's really quite a crazy thing. And an Egyptian bee means bit, and it carries the same numeric value as meteorite, 443, if I remember correctly. And so there's a lot of things that kind of tie that together.
It is interesting as well. There may or may not be something in this, but also I noticed the casing of the black stone is rather like the shape of a vulva. So
very
it's
much so.
Sacred feminine, isn't it?
I just visited that again because they used to keep Istanbul used to keep the maintenance of Mecca, and they have the shrouds there, and you can now go and kind of get up close to them and photograph them, and very, very, very interesting. And so, you know, yeah, but Kybele wasn't the only bee goddess. I mean, there were lots of them. You look at the statues of Artemis in Cephas today; she's laden with bees, and it's, you know, that's a powerful place. The Temple of Artemis is really, if you've been there, it's just so incredibly charged. No wonder it's, you know, one of the seven ancient wonders of the world. But you know, the whole bee veneration thing, it goes back so far. Bees, 100 million years old, have been petrified in amber as though they've been immortalized and frozen in their own honey. And ancients looked at that and thought, oh, that's special. I mean, they've always been venerated. Sumerians had poems about them, and really hot, you know, Inanna, really hot, steamy, sexy poems about bees and honey. And even, you know, the drone bees who mate with the queen bee and then die. Forgive me, they have no stinger, which is interesting because going back to Kybele, the priest who venerated Kybele had no stinger because they cut it off. It's this kind of, you know,
bloody painful.
Bloody painful. You literally the blood for a good reason. And yeah, you know, so everyone thinks that Sumeria is, you know, the birthplace of, you know, civilization, but you know, Serbia, old Europe, the Vinci culture, there's these masks, these carvings, and they have really, really big eyes, clearly not extraterrestrial, but drone bee. And when I went to Mexico a few years back, I couldn't, going to all the temples, I couldn't believe the statues and the reliefs of the kings, because they have these huge bee eyes. I'm like, I must be imagining this. Well, how come no one's ever spoken about it? So just the littlest bit of research, and in their mythology, the sun is stolen and taken into the underworld, and it's a bee that goes down there and saves it and brings it back. So the kings have these big bee eyes in honor of having saved the world by bringing the sun back. And, you know, talking about reliefs and statues, one of my favorite memories is going with a friend to the British Museum and really studying the Assyrian statues, because I was obsessed with what's in the bag, right? You know, these stone bags.
Yeah, the handbags, yeah.
Every single era's got these stone handbags. What's in the bag? You feel like Brad Pitt in Seven. What's in the box? What's in the bag?
He's got the handbag and the Rolex watch on, hasn't he?
Exactly. And a lot of these statues have a eagle-headed or a king-headed figure holding the bag in one hand, and in the other hand they have what appears to be a pine cone. And I'm standing there in the Assyrian section of the British Museum, and this really confident guy with all kinds of swagger comes in with a tour of 20 people. And I don't know what overcame me, but I said, excuse me, sorry, just a quick question. Sorry, guys. What's in the bag? And he looked at me and said, I thought you would know. I'm like, pollen. I'm like, pollen? Well, then how about the pine cone? And he said, it's not a pine cone. It's a date palm. And they're dipping the date palm symbolically into the pollen to symbolically bless their kingdom, to pollinate it. And I was just like, you're kidding me. So he left, and I was just dumbfounded because I researched that so much and I've never found that before. And I went to the information desk to ask how I could find him again and get his details. And they said, a European man leading a tour of 20 people in the Assyrian section? That didn't happen. We wouldn't allow that. Nobody did that today. I'm like, oh, come on. I saw them. Like, no, didn't happen. But people still talk about what's in the bag, but he convinced me that it could just be a symbolic representation of pollen, which the ancient world was, this magical substance.
Yeah, well, it sounds about right to me.
It does, yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
Definitely.
And even my country, the United States, where I'm from anyways, the most iconic monument in the whole place is what? The Washington's Monument, the huge obelisk. What does it say? To our Lord, the honeybee. To our Lord, Deseret. And Deseret is the Mormon word for honeybee. But, excuse me, I'm just kind of winging this. DSRT, I think, is the Egyptian word that is used to describe the red kingdom of Egypt. And it was red because their bees have, their honey was red. And so you have this word Deseret, which gets morphed into the Mormon world, referring to honeybee. And the whole Western United States, 4 or 5 state region, was called Deseret, the honeybee. And I've also written a lot about the Mormons. Have you seen Book of Mormon?
No.
I haven't read the Book of Mormon, no.
The play is just, I think it's amazing because it really rips apart any religion. It just happens to be Mormons they're talking about, but it's every religion, and all the silliness that goes along with some of the rules. And it's like the only play I've ever seen where 25 to 30% of the audience just gets up and leaves because it's just too nasty, but very funny. The Mormons support, Joseph Smith. Nobody makes fun of Moses. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and he's sunburned and he's talking to God and he's got a tablet. Everybody believes that hook, line, and sinker. But poor Joseph Smith speaks to an angel and gets some tablets, and he's a crazy man and nobody wants to hear it. How is that any different? But they write about bees from the ancient world, Sumeria, going across the continent through Mongolia to China, then across the ocean, and they become the Olmecs. And the Olmecs have reliefs that are almost, in fact, they are identical to Minoan reliefs. And then the Olmecs kind of that sort of morphs into the Mormons. So it's just such an interesting, piece of history that's discredited. But when you look at it, it seems to remember when bees were taken from the Middle East the other way around the world to the south of Mexico, then up into the United States.
Yeah, I have interest. Is there any reference to bees in the Bible that you know of?
Well, we were talking about Cephas and Artemis. The priests were called Essenes and king bees.
Essenes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jesus is referred to as the ethereal bee. John survived on honey in the desert and locusts. And there's it was a crop circle of John the Baptist on his feast day of a bee in Wiltshire. So there's lots of stuff in the Bible. The Song of Deborah, DBRE, means so the Song of the Bee, and she's a warrior princess. There's this great spirited, take no prisoners woman. Really, really amazing. And so all that stuff has kind of been, not so much airbrushed, but just ignored. And it's
not near it, yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of my fantasy that, as Egypt and all the amazing things we see in Egypt is still 2/3 covered in sand.
Yeah. I've always thought that as well. You're just desperate to have a look under there, aren't you?
Desperate. And what if there's huge temples to the bee? And who was it? I forget, oh God, the chap's name. He was in the south of Turkey, and he came across a pre-sand map of Egypt. Very famous guy, and he just went boom. He went like did a beeline straight to Egypt. Imagine having a pre-sand map.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, you do hear as well. I mean, going back to the, I think it was 1930 something, there was several newspaper articles about them finding a huge city under Giza. Now that's gone very quiet on that, hasn't it, recently? You didn't really hear any more about that.
Yeah, there's so much about what's beneath Giza, and you have to believe it's all true. Casey spoke about it. There's all this stuff going on in Romania, by the Sphinx head in Romania. People will laugh this off, but there's like this great big tunnel system, and one tunnel goes to the inner earth, the other tunnel goes to like a hall of records, just like Case said it was, that has all these like ancient discs that have the history of the galaxies and crazy stuff. But it's not just the Osiris temple that's down there. It's got to be like a whole city of stuff. And like you say, the old newspaper articles printed, but now it's all airbrushed.
Yeah, well, they don't want people to know the truth, do they? Because once they start knowing the truth, then unfortunately, lots of beliefs go up in the air, don't they?
Well, I think as well, sadly as well, that some of these things tend to get jumped on by people, and they kind of usurp the whole story into merging it into something entirely different, and then it all gets into the realms of nonsense then, doesn't it? And so it kind of muddies the waters. But I do know, because I've come across the original articles myself. There was one, there's a couple in England that I've seen, and also there was one printed in Australia as well. And they do talk about the excavation and a huge city complex found underneath Giza.
Yeah, I bet. And, the same thing with the Grand Canyon, right? Speaking of Egyptians in the Grand Canyon, another treatment I've written, if anyone's listening, ancient Egyptians in America, massive 6-part series. Please, somebody buy it. There's so much there, but you look at the old newspaper clippings of the cave systems in the Grand Canyon. Holy cow! All kinds of stuff, and the place names are all Egyptians.
Mm.
And I sort of planning my next holiday to Georgia, because I'm doing some research on the back of the mighty Robert Temple, who I think, if you read the Cirrus Mystery, it's like almost on every page he has an idea that could be a book. And I've been to his home, and we've spent some time talking and researching, and I've watched him. I've watched his brain work, where we're trying to identify a lake where the Amazonian women were in Libya. And he's like, okay, so it would have had to been here, there. Let me Google, boom, boom, boom. Must have been that. And you're like, damn, you're right. But in the Cirrus Mystery, he talks about one of my favorite subjects, which is Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece.
All right. Yeah.
And he brilliantly concludes the Golden Fleece was probably saffron. And Jason steals it from where it was grown, which is in modern day Georgia, takes it around the Med because it's the only known cure for grout. And but Georgia, according to Herodotus, was the home of the Egyptians.
Okay.
So the Egyptians were like everywhere.
Yeah, I think they were really well-traveled people. I think sort of in mainstream history, they don't really tend to touch on that too much. But from the things that I've seen, and it's led me to, I would say very much that they were very well-traveled people.
It was linked to Ireland, wasn't they, with a princess there? Was it a princess?
Yeah.
Boat or something they found in there?
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
And the Egyptians and the Minoans were really close. They were contemporaries, and the Minoans, they're one of their biggest symbols is the double axe. An axe on either, and that means labrys, as in labyrinth, and on Crete, the goddesses had double axes as heads. And when you look at the double axes that they portray, you quickly realize the double axes are bees, and they're suckling flowers, and they're flying. So the double axe is a symbol of a bee, and the goddesses have them as their heads. And there's some really psychedelic seals of dancing goddesses with the arms up over the head, the horizontal striped skirts, the boats with the hive in the middle. And by the way, I've seen boats on the Nile with nobody in them and what looked like the Ark of the Covenant. That's why I got so excited right in the middle. I'm like, guys, what is that? And they're like, it's a beehive. It goes up and down the Nile all year, and the bees pollinate the different parts of Egypt. It was amazing. But now I've lost my train of thought. What was I talking about a second ago?
We were talking about the Minoan civilization.
Yeah. So thank you.
You were listening.
I was listening.
Thank you. And that's what they call it, dope. And we're going to talk about drugs now, because the drugs were huge in the ancient world, and these seals and reliefs are just completely psychedelic scenes. So my research has shown that they grew poppies in large abundance on Crete, and their boats, they made little miniatures of their boats, and the floors of the boats have these like just little cup holes everywhere, hundreds of them. And they were harvesting what I believe to be psychedelic honey, which is a real thing, mixing it with opium and heroin. No one knows where the Minoans got their money. I argue they were the drug lords of the Aegean. And as soon as Crete, Thera erupts and Crete is no more, apiaries develop all around the ancient world on the Med because the supply is gone. And if people think ancient honey is nuts, I mean, on the Black Sea in Turkey, the Romans are invading and they're outnumbering the local people like 1,000 to 1. And what do the local people do? They put hives out because they know they'll be hungry. And the Romans eat the psychedelic honey and they're tripping off their heads. And the locals just like chop them up. I mean, it's really well documented. So, and in Crete, you have the most famous item from the Bronze Age, the Malia bee pendant. Google that. It's incredible. 2 bees next to each other with a pollen cage above their head. It's absolutely priceless. And they said it was from a cemetery. And I went and I broke into this place because it's high security. It's not a cemetery, it's a temple. And I took the whole thing apart of where they had found it. And it's on an altar. And I'm like, okay, why would the most priceless artifact, which is 2 bees, why would it be thrown on an altar? But if you look on the map, it is exactly, I mean, not close, exactly a straight line to Thera. Volcano was. And when Thera erupts, it's not like boom, it's over. It's several times over 90 years. So they know it's coming. And I argue that they created a temple to make sacrifices to the gods for Thera not to annihilate them. And there's, what do you call them, riothons of where they used to, big jugs of blood. They probably did sacrifices there, etc. And when you look at the famous bull leaping ritual, which they did on Crete, and it's a great painting of a bull, and someone is up in front holding its horns, and Crete has 2 horns, and it's shaped like a bull. And someone's leaping over it. And that's like an ancient ritual across the ancient world. But where the person is leaping over the bull is the exact spot where that temple was, where the Malia bee pendant was sacrificed, and where Thera erupted and the tsunamis came and wiped out Crete. So it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, we've been to Crete, haven't we?
Yeah, we went many years ago to Crete, and we went to the Cave of Zeus, which was very interesting, and Knossos as well. I thought, Knossos, I always thought, I was just waking up one day, and I was thinking of Knossos, and then I thought Gnosis, and so to me, I think it is to do with Gnosis. I think this is where this comes from, this divine knowledge. And I think that you've got obviously the Minotaur, which is the half bull, half man, going through the labyrinth. I think, there's some really interesting, significant symbolism in that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And because that word labrys comes from the double axe, I've written about it, and it's easier to explain with pictures, but I hypothesize that the labyrinth could be the hive, could be allegorical for the hive.
And it's very interesting because in I don't know, you probably know this already, but in Chartres Cathedral, obviously there's a labyrinth there, but at one time there was actually a copper plate that went over the top of it, which now has disappeared. But however, it gets even more interesting because suspended above the copper plate on the labyrinth was actually a lodestone suspended from the rafters. Now, both of these things have disappeared. And upon investigating, when we went to Chartres, there was a little kind of leaflet on there explaining it. And saying that it was basically requisitioned, the copper plate was requisitioned for Napoleon's cannons, but they don't use copper for cannons. So sounds a bit dubious, but what happened to them? What was the function of it? Having conducted an experiment, I'm sure the scientists out there could probably enlighten me in this, But we did a little experiment, and we had a copper
tube,
pipe,
yeah.
and we had one of those little round neodymium magnets, and I dropped it through the copper pipe. But instead of gravity, where it falls straight to the bottom, it actually almost levitated. It just basically gradually slid down until it came to the bottom. So my hypothesis is that what was happening with the copper plate, as the person, most probably barefooted, was traveling around the labyrinth on the copper plate with the lodestone or magnet above their head, it was creating a field. And I believe it was in this field that it put people into kind of a meditative trance, and it basically brought about an enlightenment kind of experience for people. This is my hypothesis.
Yeah, and in a church too, in a cathedral, yeah.
Which of course, is almost certainly on ley lines as well. So there's some interesting things going on with that, I think.
That's so interesting because I've been to, I think, all of the 6 remaining, I might be wrong, turf mazes in the UK. And monks used to supposedly walk. There's one in Winchester, and there's one in Derby. There's a whole bunch of them, and as you said, they would crawl them on their hands and knees, and the sequence that you would go on would cause the brain to become and the heart more receptive to spiritual connectivity. But what you just described to me makes me think. I kind of jumped to the Tartarian world, that cathedrals were cathedors, and they were edifices for free energy and transmitting that across the land. Only later did they become used as religious centers, but what you described, I mean, that's the Tartarian kind of belief, but what you described is kind of consistent with that theory.
It's very interesting, isn't it?
Oh.
I think it seems to me, from my understandings of sort of researching and everything else and experiences, though, that these various different places, there's a reason, you go to the standing stones where the energy crosses and things, because they are kind of power centers. And I think it does affect the human psyche. And I do believe that you can have, these enlightenment experiences, because it affects you. It affects the human mind. So I think, to me, anyway, this is only my opinion, but I think a lot of these places were for that, because it was always the journey of someone to try and get that enlightenment experience.
Yeah, and you mentioned the standing stones. The whole megalithic world is something I've obsessed about for a long time, and I used to drive around the UK for my job, and I had Julian Cope's the Modern Antiquarian in my boot, and I'm going to Gloucester today. Okay,
not literally, I hope.
Pardon?
I said not literally, I hope.
Well, no, Julian Cope's book. He was the lead singer of the Teardrops Explodes, of course. The whole psychedelic revival out of Liverpool, and his book, The Modern Antiquarian, is great because it has every site in Britain. It has what Stukely said about it and what so and so said about it, but it's how to get there. The poem he wrote while he was there. It's really, really good. So I've always been obsessed with these stone circles. And to bring it back to bees for a second, who is the Lord of the Circle? I never knew this. It's Ra.
Ra.
And then I thought, curiously, and Audrey Burrell would, spend his life confirming this, and so did Thom, that the stone circles aren't really circular. they're sort of teardrop shaped. And Ra, who is the Egyptian god of a lot of things, the sun, but also of circles, cried bees as tears.
Interesting, yeah.
It's interesting, yeah. And also obviously, bees were also symbolic of resurrection and immortality as well, which is really significant.
Yeah, for sure. And they have I can't think of the name of it now, but that really, really ancient stone circle down in the south of Egypt. Boval was all over that a few years ago. I can't think what it's called now. But again, it was, teardrop shape, not circular, but really, really, really interesting, I think. And so this whole notion of drugs, I think is very under appreciated in the ancient world. They were so prevalent. I've done TV shows of Delphi where it's documented that the priest, when Thera started to erupt, the priest on Crete got in their boats with bees, sang like bees, and went not just to Greece, they went to Delphi, and there you have the Delphic bee as the priestess, who would be off her head with these hallucinogenic drugs, and then the priest would interpret them and make his conclusions for the customer. But Delphi is also a huge center. And what do you have in Delphi is the Oracle Stone. I looked at it, I'm like, oh, come on, it's ridiculous. Not only is the Oracle Stone shaped like a beehive, but it is a beehive. It has a hole in the bottom that bees can go in, and its design is crisscrossing rows of bees.
Yeah, exactly. So it shows how important it was. But it's interesting that earlier you mentioned Girona as well, because actually there was uncovered or excavated a Lucian temple, and they found a cup with what they believe is kykeon, which was basically they found evidence of ergot. Now, ergot basically is where they synthesize LSD from, which is a psychedelic drug.
Wow.
Now, they actually found a cup with that in, and they also found evidence of the ergot in the calculus, the dental calculus of one of the, I think it was a male that they excavated in his teeth. So it really demonstrates that they were very well aware of the psychedelic use of mushrooms. Ergot obviously is the fungus that grows on wheat and corn, isn't it? So they're very well aware of it. And even going into the Middle Ages, the midwives used very tiny amounts of ergot to give to women going into labor to try and ease the birthing pains as well. But I bet they were probably tripping her. Goodness.
So mushroom sales are going to rock it.
Absolutely.
So I'm just thinking it was interesting that you went to Girona, being that we were talking about the psychedelics and things, and that they had an Eleusinian temple there. It was a huge thing at one time, and there's even evidence, I believe, on some of the Egyptian temples of mushrooms. So they clearly were very well aware of it. And of course, what happens when you have these psychedelic experiences? You have psychic visions. It opens up the psychic centers in the brain. Not that I'm in any way suggesting that anyone should try it, but I'm just interested from the ancient aspect. And obviously shamans are more people that would take psychedelics to bring on an experience, an enlightenment experience.
Yeah, and also musicians and that, and artists and poets, they've all done that
exactly.
as well.
I think it's no coincidence. You look at the time of LSD in the 60s, and I think that's probably one of the most creative times we've had.
Yeah, absolutely. And it opens up other realms, doesn't it? And I know the three of us are cat lovers.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say, but we like cats. And Egyptians worship cats because they had access to that psychic realm. I mean, how many times have you sat at home when all of a sudden your cat's going, what are you looking at? It sees something.
Yeah, for sure. And they also know they can sense, when you're not feeling very well or you're feeling a bit fed up, whatever, they can sense that and they come to you, and they give you healing, I believe, as well.
I wish I had a good segue from cats back to bees, but I can't. I had a cat get stung by a bee on a bank holiday, and it cost me 300 pounds. I remember that. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy that it was such an important part of our ancestors, and yet it's kind of scoffed at today, except for maybe clubbing or something like that. But I'm just thinking if there's any other strands on the bees. That there's so many of them.
You be thinking on that, because I've just got to do our intermission mark here. So if you're just tuning in and you're joining us, you're listening to the Allens Investigate. We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and also on Roku.
I was just going to add that, Napoleon, what was his nickname? The bee. And, so he, and there's bees on his regalia and the curtains and Versailles and all that kind of thing. But he chose the bee because he was paying homage to the Merovingian long-haired kings of France, such as Childeric, who they found 300 gold bees in his tomb. And this, leads us quickly back to Rennes-le-Chateau with Dagobert and Pierre Plantard and the society that studies Dagobert has a picture of a bee and a pentagram as their logo. And even the shape of France is, if you draw a line around it, is a honeycomb, and they regard it as the shape of a honeycomb.
Well, they really are an enigma, aren't they? Bees, how they fly is just an enigma, isn't it?
Yeah. It defies all.
It does.
And I think it's interesting as well. I was going to say about the connection to Venus, because there's some very strong connections to Venus. I mean, Venus is the brightest planet in our solar system, and I think it was no coincidence that she was called Phosphorus by the Greeks, and in Latin's Lucifer, which means light bringer, not the wicked, evil Satan type figure in the Bible at all, actually.
Poor Lucifer gets such a bad rap,
Yeah.
He gets a bad rap, doesn't he?
Sounds like a good guy, really. And but to that point, going back to the Mayans, they regarded the bee as being symbolic of Venus because of its intelligent movements. And of course, Venus makes a pentagram in the sky every 7 years, and is associated with Mary Magdalene and the Mother Mary. Who's
the five-petaled flower as well.
Yeah.
The rose.
It dances in a figure eight, doesn't it? The bee.
Yeah, it's supposed to waggle in a figure eight, and of course, the transit of Venus is actually 8 years, isn't it, or 8 Earth years?
Yeah, and that that waggle dance we skipped. Thank you. We skipped completely over the waggle dance. The bee is the only insect that communicates through dance. It can go out and do a little jig, and the rest of the bees will go, okay, thanks. The food is 3 miles over that way. Got it. And they have like a sat nav, and they go and they get it. And ancients somehow knew that because they depict their goddesses as dancing goddesses.
Yeah.
The bee is dancing with its waggle dance. And not only here in England is Glastonbury the beekeepers' island, and Bridget, a bee goddess from Ireland, had a temple there, but there's just loads of mythology to this day of telling the bees. So they used to print this in the paper. There's one from somewhere in Gloucestershire where the beekeeper died, and he used to sing to his bees every day, but he died, and they buried him 3 miles away. And as they were putting the cactus into the ground, everyone went, and all the bees were coming single file, went into the ground, landed on his coffin. They actually called the newspaper because the bees were just resting there, and the newspaper came out and covered it. And, so you're supposed to, when you get married, when the beekeeper dies, you have to tell the bees so that they don't swarm.
Exactly. You're supposed to tell them any major significant news, aren't you?
Yeah. And
I think actually quite a lot of beekeepers have forgotten these old ways, because I remember talking to some a few years ago. We went to a country fair and there was some there that they were selling their honey and things. And I said this about, well, do you tell them about all your news? And they said, pardon? They didn't know anything about it.
No news today.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these ways have been forgotten, sadly.
Yeah, and I'm not a beekeeper, and that's the one big. There's many big gaps to my understanding. The older I get, the more I research, the less you know, right? But not being a beekeeper, I'm missing out on a whole big element of that connection.
I mean, we're really lucky where we are, because in our garden, because we live in the countryside, and I've deliberately planted plants that attract bees. And so we've been very lucky. Now, earlier on in the year, when I expected to see the bees, I was getting very worried because I wasn't seeing hardly any. And I thought, oh, gosh, something's going on. And then all of a sudden, they just came, which was amazing. Yeah, but the story of, when we went for a walk and we found a bee struggling on the floor. And so I put my hand out and she crawled onto my hand. And I gave her a little bit of water to try and, give her some sustenance, because that's all we had on us. She wouldn't leave. And I think she must have been on there for a good sort of 45 minutes to an hour.
She wouldn't go off, would she?
She wouldn't leave. I tried to sort of encourage her to go on a flower, and she wouldn't go. No. So in the end, I said, well, it's getting a bit late now.
We drove her home, didn't we?
So I put my seatbelt on and we drove with her on my hand all the way home. And I gave her some sugar water, and it was absolutely incredible, because after that, she just... all of a sudden, she started pulsing, which obviously warms the muscles up. Yeah. And she then hovered up. She turned around and looked at me and sort of did a little dance. And then she zoomed off back the direction where we just come from.
It was amazing, because she was like on her last legs, wasn't she, on the floor, and that guy picked her up, didn't he?
So that was lovely.
Yeah, wonderful story, that. Yeah, beautiful, yeah.
Oh, bless you. You're a bee rescuer. Bee savior.
Very famous for that bee rescue.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's at least 3 or 4 states of consciousness that have all claimed they hear a buzzing sound. No, not a buzzing sound. Bees. One is yoga. The other one is near-death experience, apparitions, and I'm not going to think of the fourth one, where they all historically have said, the kids at Fatima, they said, so you heard some kind of weird buzzing. Said, no, it wasn't weird. It was bees. We heard bees. We saw the apparition. So it's something about state changes in consciousness that you hear that sound.
And when we see you, I'll tell you a little story about an experience I had with that as well, which is quite interesting.
The Egyptian one.
The Egyptian one.
Yeah. Ooh, wow. I'll look forward to that.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're fascinating. So, I mean, obviously the ancients also viewed bees as obviously not only symbolic of immortality and resurrection, hence why they're also connected with Christ, but also they were seen as messengers, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely as messengers. And Artemis, the moon goddess, is where souls from the moon would be imputed on Earth as bees. Bees would come from the moon as new souls. Plato talked about people who were stung by a bee on their tongue were blessed with eloquence, and they always have such positivity associated with them. And you know, way back, if you look at Châteauheug, the world's oldest town, what's it like going on 9,000 years old, they have a temple that has bulls in it, which is interesting because you have Apis, Latin for bee, but it also has a honeycomb design on a huge wall, just honeycomb design. And they have the same thing in Aboriginal Australia, 8,000 BC. So something about that shape as well. And I just went to Malta, and in the hypogeum, they have the same design, and you can hear the sound of. There's one room, the Oracle room. I don't know if have you been to the hypogeum?
No, I've not been to Malta actually.
Yeah, I've been to Malta. Yeah.
You go to the hypogeum. They're like, whatever you do in the Oracle room, don't sing. I'm like, well, you've just invited me to sing. There's 8 people in the I'm going to wait until they leave. And, you know, I did my thing, and wow, it was incredible. But it was worth it. Okay, so Malta, which means honey in ancient Greek, has the bees with the world's biggest abdomen. They're huge bees. And what do you have on Malta? The world's biggest goddesses, and not just big statues of goddesses, but the temples, if you look at them from the air, are shaped like bees. And they have a 2,000-year-old apiary that I went to visit just a couple months ago. And I noticed that next to it were little temples and then a long Roman road. And there was a harbor nearby. And I just got to thinking, and I looked at this Roman road and I walked it. And I'm like, it may have been a Roman road, but to me, it's a spirit path. It's a spirit path. And I think that they were bringing bodies who are either people already deceased or near death in the harbor up to this ritual center. And they have an apiary, so they have the honey, and they have these temples nearby. Then they have the spirit path. So, you know, it's something I'm researching that I think that has something to do with how to prepare or send off the soul to the next place.
Out of interest, do you think it relates to sort of astrological alignments in the sky as well?
Could very well do that. Could very well do that. I didn't even look at that. But it's like a 2 or 3 mile straight, narrow path with tombs on either side. So I don't think it's, you know, may have been a Roman road later, but I think it originally had another purpose. And then, you know, in Egypt had the most aggressive bee in the history of the world. And so the beekeepers, in order not to spook the bee, you had to be naked.
Isn't that a bit dangerous?
Very dangerous.
Very, oh my God. I should
on a sausage.
And they had to shave their
Oh
heads.
my God.
Now, if you go into the British Museum, I saw another tour in the British Museum. There's a relief, excuse me, of the last pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, and he's paying homage to this. And on tour, they were saying it's the Philosopher's Stone. I'm like, well, no, it's not Philosopher's Stone. 1, he's naked. 2, he's the king. His title is beekeeper, and he's holding, I think, a honeycomb because it's the revered, you know, byproduct of the sacred bee. So it's everywhere, and I think it's like that red mini. When someone says, "Oh, look at that nice red mini," you see red minis all day. Once you're shown the symbolism of the bee is everywhere, you start to see it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, the things like the honey itself. I mean, they found, I think we're going back a few, I think it's 2015, but archaeologists found 3,000-year-old honey when they're excavating the tombs in Egypt, and it was still okay to eat. So it's absolutely incredible stuff, isn't it?
It really is. And I wish, you know, half the things in my fridge lasted, you know, 3 weeks, let alone.
You might have some psychedelic fungus growing on your bread or something.
Psychedelic mold.
You know what else is really interesting? The Egyptians were really into their instruments, and they created the first trumpet. And they found trumpets in Tutankhamun's tomb. When the new queen is born, or being coordinated as, okay, I am going to take over the hive now. It's the sound of her piping, the queen bee piping. And it, so Google that and listen to it. The sound of the queen bee piping is, bringing in the new queen, and she's going to, take at least half of the hive with her. The Egyptians were the first to create trumpets, and the sound is identical. And to this day, trumpets are used to pipe in royalty.
That's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I got a great love of the Elizabethans. So, and I'm going to have to refresh my memory on the bees with the Elizabethans, because I'm sure it was very significant among Francis Bacon and the others. Yeah, definitely Marlowe and that.
Yeah, Shakespeare wrote about bees. They all wrote about bees. This is why I have stuff in my presentation, so I don't have to remember anything. You sound really intelligent when it's written down. Yeah, they've all written about bees.
You could say to be or not to be.
To be or not to be.
Exactly. And even Rosslyn Chapel, right? Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, they found a beehive up in the top of it. That's really part of the original design.
And it's very Masonic as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and the Masons thought that bees were, there were king bees, not queen bees. So they referred to them as king bees. And you have beehives, which are, universal wisdom symbol in all their imagery on their regalia, in particular, their aprons. And the bees are just, I'm trying to think of how the ritual goes. I used to be a Mason, no longer a Mason, but regular orderly society, which is part of the Masonic kind of theme, is a reflection of how bees are in a hive. One for all, altruistic,
and the cooperation and everything as well.
For sure,
yeah. And so, also my favorite, the Illuminati, right? 1776, May 1st, Weshwaput creates the world's most famous secret society, but he wanted to call it bees, but the name was already taken. So he called it Illuminati. Imagine if, he had called it bees. Just have a completely different connotation. And now we'd be talking about the evil cabal of bees that rule the world.
Killer bees.
Well, yeah, it always makes me laugh, Andrew, with that. When you read about the Illuminati and you're thinking to yourself, it just, and someone who's illumined is enlightened, isn't it? So it's a sad thing that it's got a bit mixed up with people who know absolutely nothing about enlightenment, really.
Exactly. We should leave the evil connotations to the World Economic Forum and things like that. Exactly. Sorry, don't want to get you banned here. Yeah, I mean, it could have been a totally different connotation if bees were associated. And bees are they've been demonized. I mean, killer bees. It was only Jerry Seinfeld who came out with the film. What was that? The film about the bees that he did had the classic line, "Bees are only in it for the honey." I can't think of the name. Bee Movie, of course it was.
Bee Movie.
And
these are the jokes, folks.
The beehive hairstyles, even Lana Del Rey,
right.
all the '60s girl groups. Amy Winehouse, but also the films, Metropolis, this kind of hive culture where everyone just behaves like everyone else, kind of a industrial, unpleasant version of the hive. And one of my favorite esoteric thinkers, the absolute genius that is Rudolf Steiner, was obsessed with bees, wrote about bees, and his 9 lectures on bees in Dornach, Switzerland. You can buy the book, and it's this great dialogue of him just talking about mind-bending things about the universe and bees. And there's Mr. Mueller in the front row who's pausing Steiner like every 30 seconds to say, "Excuse me, what are you talking about? Could you explain that?" And Steiner very respectfully and patiently explains himself. But Steiner, I think it was 1923, he said that based upon the way the bees were being fed, artificially fed their own larvae, the queen bee, and that was a practice that was in place for 15 years, taking it back to 1908, that in 100 years, the bees would start to die. And sure enough, 100 years later, 60% of the bees in the world had died exactly when Steiner said they would.
Yeah, Steiner schools are very interesting for children, aren't they? Because they are allowed to grow in their own way and learn in their own way, which is wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, I love the Steiner school. I presented to the Steiner group in Germany, Lake Constance. Tough crowd. They really know their stuff. They had just finished. Oh my God! I hung out with the Steiner elders, and they had just finished a walk-in of the god Sin. Sin. The god Sin decided he wanted to come back and incarnate, and it chose one of the senior Steiner school instructors. So they had this ritual. They sat around in a circle. The guy sat in the table. They did the ritual, and he just went limp. And then he's back, but he's back like God's Sin, and he can't speak, and he can't drive a car. And his wife's like, "What the hell?" And so it was a fascinating story. Those Steiner guys really, they're into all that stuff. It's cool.
Wow. So what happened then in the end, or don't you know?
I know, and when I see you, I'll tell you, because it's it's so color that you can't possibly guess. It's just, I would blush if I told you.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I think I've got a few ideas actually.
No, unbelievable. But yeah, I'll tell you.
Okay. But it is very interesting, and I think it's this link between bees and goddesses, though. So there's a really, really strong link with, as we said, with Venus, and obviously Venus was also called the Queen of Heaven, like the Queen Bee, which is quite interesting. She is also involved with unconditional love, resurrection, enlightenment, immortality, and I think it's also quite interesting that the planetary symbol of Venus is almost identical to the Egyptian Ankh, isn't it?
Ooh. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And the Ankh is a fascinating symbol, very similar to the anchor. And without the anchor, you couldn't stop your boat. You couldn't navigate the seas without an anchor. So I think the anchor is a really underestimated symbol of importance. And I wonder if it isn't one and the same with the Ankh. I remember it's a crazy story. I blogged about it like 15 years ago. I'm in the supermarket, Waitrose. I turn the corner, I smash into a woman with my cart, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." An embarrassing moment. And she's wearing a blazer with a t-shirt. And I said, "I like your Ankh." And she's like, "Huh?" I'm like, on your shirt. She goes, "It's an anchor." I'm like, Oh, it's identical to an anchor. So I wonder if there's something linguistically that
I wouldn't be surprised. It's interesting that we have anchoresses as well, isn't it?
yes, up where you live, there's anchoresses, and I've studied anchoresses because young women usually illegitimate children of royalty at the age of 12 or 13, they would be locked into a cell where you couldn't even swing a cat and spend the rest of their life there, devotion to God, usually with the window open on the altar and a window that can bring in food and take out waste. But that was their life. And the Knights Templar seemed to have really highly regarded them, as you would expect, and supported them. And so I've done some research into anchoresses, Norwich being very, very famous one, right?
Union of Norwich, yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. But obviously in that sort of being on their own and sort of away from everybody, though, that's the quietness and the peace that they need to go within and then, connect with the higher realms.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, an anchoress plays into some work that I'm doing. A lot of these sites, these ancient sites, particularly Templar, I've come to understand are protected. I know it sounds nuts, but they're protected spiritually, magically, and one of the ones that I'm involved in excavating, an anchoress, is someone who was befriended by the Templar, and as crazy as it sounds, is the guardian of what's buried there.
I can believe that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
But I wonder with the anchor though, because obviously it's got the two bits off it, because for sure the Ankh and Venus is to do with the manifestation of divine life force, but it's also about the divine union of opposites as well. So I wonder if it's got to do with that.
Nice. No, I like that. Venus is it's just such a dynamic image, dynamic movement, and it's been observed as such for such a long time by culture. And of course, again, associated with Mary Magdalene and the Mother Mary.
Exactly, yeah.
And the Mother Mary, you get into, if anyone ever wants to read a heavyweight when it comes to one of the only people really writing about it today is Marguerite Rigoluso. Oh, she is just amazing. PhD, serious stuff. She writes about the ancient goddesses. They all had the name of Parthenogen in their ancient title, and parthenogenesis is having a child, same sex, having a daughter without a man. And bees, can do that. It's a virgin brood, it's called. And then, so you have the Mother Mary, and it's interesting that the Mother Mary is associated with, and there's the huge statue of her in her alleged home in Cephas, which is literally a stone's throw right down the block, as it were, from the Temple of Artemis, whose statues are laden with bees. I mean, it all is kind of tied together.
Yeah, it's interesting that snakes, there's certain snakes that have virgin births as well, isn't it? I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it, really? So men are not really needed.
Oh, I don't know about that, Dirk. You're very good for carrying shopping.
What? See how I get treated, Andrew? It's outrageous, isn't it?
I feel your pain. I understand.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I'm surprised that the whole state of the world hasn't latched on to this virgin birth thing. Don't get me started, but you know what I'm talking about with all the silliness and having babies and that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting with Venus as well, because I mean, she's obviously also associated with Mother Mary in the Bible as well. But what's interesting about that, because she was called the light bringer, but she was the also known as the morning star and the evening star as well. So you could say it was the two Marys then, couldn't you?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
I like
good.
that. Well, I now know who I can interview for the documentary on the Jean Cocteau mural in Leicester Square. You guys have got that down. The symbolism of Mary's, all the other crazy stuff going on in that relief.
Yes, it's fascinating.
It is fascinating, absolutely. But I'm really intrigued by the Girona thing. I think it's fascinating that you were drawn there. You see, because I'm very much a believer in synchronicity. I don't believe in coincidences. I think that things happen for a reason. I think meeting you happened for a reason.
Yeah.
So I'm very much.
I think what is interesting as well is when you're on this path or a spiritual path. The end goal is truth. That is the end goal. But the on the journey, you sort of come up with something 20 years ago, and it resurfaces again. Yes. And then your knowledge is obviously much greater then. So you begin to understand, and then you'll be able to put the pieces together.
Yeah, and there's like whole audiences that understandably have not come across these mysteries before, and they're just getting into it. And it's kind of cyclical, but when it comes back up again, like, you know, what really happened on the crucifixion? Did it happen? Somebody else crucified? Did he live? Why did they bring him all this aloe and myrrh, which you only bring for somebody with wounds, not a dead person? All that kind of stuff comes up again. It's as fascinating as it was for me, you know, the first time you heard it, really.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it's a as you're going along the journey, it's really strange because you know, you think of something that was 20 years ago, like, for example, Henry Lincoln came up for me 20 years ago, and then it came full circle when I went with Hamilton White, and we went to France to pick up all the Henry Lincoln collection. So it just shows you, like 20 years later, it's amazing how it sort of resurfaces itself.
He's a cool guy. I've never met him. I'd like to meet him. I look at his Instagram and I think, damn you.
Hamilton, yeah.
We'll have to arrange a big meetup.
Oh, absolutely. A powwow.
Yes. Oh, I would like that.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. No, we'll definitely do that. Yeah.
He's just too cool.
Something else that I find quite interesting as well are cubes. And I think the earliest reference that we have to a goddess worshipped as a cube shape actually is from Neolithic Anatolia as well. And I think that's really interesting. And also Kubaba as well, which sounds like cube, doesn't it? Kubaba.
Yeah. And of course the Kaaba, the building that encloses the black stone at Mecca is a cube. I wasn't aware of that. Can you tell me a little more? I mean, so you're saying that the shape of the cube is
basically the earliest reference that we have to goddesses that were worshipped as cube-shaped stones is actually from Neolithic Anatolia, which is really interesting.
I had not heard that.
I was thinking about, you know, that to do, and also the ideograms for Kubaba in the Hittite alphabet was a lozenge or cube, which is really interesting because that then relates to the Kaaba again, doesn't it? Because it's obviously the temple is square shaped, isn't it? And then we sort of think Kaaba means cube, but then we get to thinking of something that you thought of years ago is Kabbalah, which is cube and God, isn't it?
Cube and God, yeah.
So that all kind of links in, doesn't it?
But, so it's funny because I said that to someone and he nearly fell off his chair.
But also because you were talking about the double-headed axe, but Kubaba, that was one of her symbols, was the double-headed axe as well. Also the dove, a vase, or a door or gate. which is interesting, and Aphrodite at Paphos, as well as Cybele at Pessinus and later Rome, and Astarte at Byblos and Artemis of Ephesus were known to have been associated with black stones. So that was interesting.
I've seen Aphrodite's on Cyprus. It's amazing. And now I kind of have an image in my mind of what Cybele could have looked like.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it? But also something I came across recently was the cubes in Petra. Have you seen those? Anything to do with that? Well, there's supposed to be over 20 giant cube-shaped rocks marking out a sacred area, and in the center of the city was a sacred cube.
Wow. Well, I know you've had my friend Graham Phillips on the show, and I think Graham spot on with his Mount Sinai being the mountain at Petra. And the staff of Moses, that's the staff of Tuthmos in the Birmingham Museum. I think he's onto something there. I did not know any of that. I love that whole concept of the cube and the goddess, and it's got me thinking of the magic squares, which are they somehow a one-dimensional, magic square where there's nine squares, I think, in a box, and numbers in each of them. In any direction adds up to the same number. The one in Barcelona I just visited adds up to 33, so it's the Jesus magic square. But is a magic square a one-dimensional version of a cube?
It's very interesting.
Cubes are really important, aren't they? And I think that sort of going back in really ancient times and Abrahamic times, I mean, it's interesting that their altars were also cubes. And Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies, was a cube. And the Holy City was a cube. So they were clearly very important, weren't they?
And the Jewish hat's a cube, isn't it?
Yeah, the little, I don't know what you call them. I don't know what you call them. The little black cube that they wear on their head at the Wailing Wall is also a cube, isn't it?
Oh, you're onto something. You need to keep going with that.
We've got cubism, and we've got a wonderful print by a cubist.
I just saw something on Telegram where they were like demonizing Trump because Trump Towers has the same cube up on top that is the same as the one in Mecca, and somehow the cube is satanic.
I think it's because they're linking it to Saturn, aren't they? That's what the whole big deal about that. But it goes a little beyond that, in my opinion. It does, yeah. Its meaning is something slightly different to what they're trying to.
We'll tell you when we see you.
Yeah,
we're waiting for our invite from Donald and Melania. If you're listening, Donald, invite us all for dinner.
I'm sure we'd have a fascinating conversation.
Oh yes.
But also something that also I thought was interesting, as we were touching again on Mecca there, was I think it's very interesting that what they're actually doing. So when they go on their Hajj and they're basically going anti-clockwise.
Yes.
In a circular anti-clockwise motion, which, as I mentioned, is basically the same way that the sun moves and processes in an anti-clockwise motion, which might tell you something. But also, isn't it interesting that it's a circle in a square? So they're squaring the circle.
Love it. Absolutely. I'm already going to get myself in trouble by saying that that black stone is Alat, the old woman, Cybele, meteorite, Grail. But it's I probably shouldn't say. I'll get in more trouble. I won't even go there.
Okay.
Tell us when you say.
Sorry. Be careful.
But we understand. We understand.
I mean, we're talking about pre Muhammad. In all reverence and respect, it's pre that. And I think there is a lot of very, very interesting history pre that.
Yeah.
And it is very much worth delving into and having a look at, because it's quite enlightening.
Yeah, I've always wanted to go on the Hajj, and I know that sounds really disrespectful, but I would love to be there and be part of that, counterclockwise procession. Wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that just, and there are people who have done it, and it's incredible. You'll take your life into your own hands. It's very sacrilegious to do that, but I think it would be an incredible experience.
It is really interesting. I mean, I have seen some people aligning it as well, again, pre-Muhammad Islamic times, quite interestingly, with the Hindu sort of religion as well. So they were sort of talking about it possibly of having been a Shiva temple, which I think is quite interesting, because there are similarities in some of the things that go on there. So I think that's quite interesting.
Does have a strong Indian link, yeah.
There's a dish or something I seem to recall coming across, and forgive me because I can't remember the name of the king, but it was Vikram something or other, I can't remember, but it was actually, funnily enough, in the a library in Istanbul, and it talks about this king, this Indian king, that actually was ruling that part of Kuwait. So I think that's quite interesting.
Wow.
So there is definitely a connection. And they used to use that as a trade route, the Indians as well, didn't they, I think?
Yeah. That's fascinating.
So I think there would have been absolutely no question. You need to look at some Indian influences at the very least. If it was a trade route, they would have, obviously intermingle with people, swap stories and information. But I think that goes without saying.
You've got 2 or 3 books just begging to be written there.
It's a whole new world.
Oh my gosh. And the cube. I love the cube.
Yeah.
That's really fresh.
It's very, very interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting.
Yeah, it is. But it's all fascinating stuff. And I hope that whether people agree or they disagree, whatever,
it matters not. It
doesn't matter. I think the point of it is, if it sparks some interest and people go and think, oh, there's just something, there was just even one thing that sparks their interest.
Go and do some research myself.
Go and do some research for themselves to find some information out, then brilliant. I think we've all done our job then, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think people just, if you could make people just think, oh, that's odd, that's unusual, I wonder why it's that way, or I didn't realize that that's how it actually is. Wonder is something I think we've lost the art of.
I think you have to look into all things, and it's like when we've had Ralph Ellis on the show. A lot of people might not agree with Ralph, but he's done a lot of research, and you've got to look into the research. Don't just dismiss it. You've got to look into it, isn't it?
Well, and Ralph is, he's got a brain like a planet. He's amazing, and if you have dinner with him, you're just like, oh my God, I was just listening to you. But he addresses, like, one of my favorite questions is, how come the Bible, the Old Testament, which talks about the Holy Family going to Egypt, doesn't mention the pyramids?
Exactly.
Come on. I mean, Jerusalem, the Holy Land, it's right there. How can you not talk about it? So Ralph has just completely linguistically gone into it and said, well, Moses didn't go up Mount Sinai, he went in Mount Sinai, and he has Mount Sinai as the Great Pyramid, which sounds really nutty, but when Ralph describes it, you're like, wow, it's brilliant.
No, he has a good brain. We've met some wonderful people, including yourself, Andrew. Many people with great brains, and we're privileged to have met you. So I think we've got to wrap up, haven't we, dear?
Well, it's coming up to that
Sadly.
time, I'm afraid, isn't it? This seems to have gone very quickly, but I just want to say thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on the show
bless
again.
you.
It's your 3rd time now, and we really appreciate
I'm honored.
it.
My pleasure.
Bless you.
Great fun.
if you're thank you, I should say, for joining us on the Allens Investigate. You can check us out at www.theallensinvestigate.com and on Instagram and on Facebook. We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and also find us on Roku TV. So, Andrew, thanks once again for being a wonderful guest, super interesting, and be blessed.
Oh, thank you. And I'll see you both soon.
See you soon. Take care.
Andrew. You
Thanks,
take
guys.
care.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks for
Bye.
watching.